minutes, he says. 2 seconds. Okay, 1, and here we are. Okay, so tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai, ki te kaupapa o te ara. Welcome to this activity today. It's the second day of the VSVR Conference 2020. We have our plenary speakers. My name's Carolyn Cordery. I'm a professor at Aston University and I'm treasurer of VSSN. I just want to remind you that as a participant in the session, your mics are off, your videos are off, but please, if you want to chat amongst yourselves, use the chat, and please post questions to the speakers in the Q&A function, which John Dean and I will keep an eye on and pose to the speakers after their speaking. Now, the full speaker bios are on your program, so I'm only going to briefly introduce each of our very informed speakers. They've been asked to speak on the topic of experiencing civil society responses to COVID-19. And before I ask them to speak, I'm going to pull on a Maori proverb, which I'll say now: I kora, e teia, e te whenua kotahi, ki te kraranga, i te whariki, kia mohio tātou, kia tātou. And this is the tapestry of understanding cannot be woven by one strand alone. And so that is why we've drawn on 4 people to share their experiences. First, I'm going to ask Karl to speak. He's been the Chief Executive of NCVO since 2019, and he was previously the Director of Public Policy and Volunteering. So he oversees NCVO's work to connect, support, and represent over 4,000 member organisations across the country. Karl, we'd love to hear your experience.
Thank you, Carolyn, and hi everyone. It's been a time of massive change. I think is sort of the overarching message, sort of first to sort of say to you. And it's interesting, all those reports from a decade ago about 2020 vision. I think no one saw this one coming, I think, is my first observation. In thinking about responses, it sort of strikes me that you can think almost sort of in sort of 2 dimensions. The first being what you might call the internal versus the external response. So internally, in terms of how organizations in the sector have sort of had to reorganize themselves and fundamentally differently go about their job of work, versus externally in terms of what has their response been to the outside world and helping communities through. And then secondly, I think we probably need to think about short-term versus long-term response. There was a really short-term sort of compressed crisis period where we all suddenly had to completely stop what we were doing.
Oh, we may have lost Karl here. Oh, we've lost Karl completely. That's so I'm just wondering, should we move to Anna and give Karl another go when he's found himself?
Yeah.
Okay, so Anna, I'd like to ask you to speak. She's been the Chief Executive of the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations since 2018, where she oversees the policy work, the advocacy and the service support on behalf of the sector across Scotland. Anna, would you like to share with us your experience of living COVID? Karl, just a minute. Karl, are we going to go back to you or are we going to go with Anna?
I'm happy to carry on. I don't know why I got thrown out then.
Sorry, Anna. Okay, so you were talking about the short term versus the long term.
So I hope what I was saying is that I think we have to think about things in terms of a short and a long-term response. So there was that very immediate sort of everyone having to pivot and change things in terms of how they reacted. But we also now need to think about the longer term and what some people are calling sort of phase 2 or the shift to recovery, or what the civil servants called living with a COVID resilient economy. And I think some of that language is quite important because it's almost to me like when people are thinking about the experience of COVID, they're already moving on and thinking that we're in a recovery phase. And I'm not quite sure actually that lots of us have reached that recovery phase yet. We're still dealing with the shock if you will, of sort of the first phase of COVID. And then finally, I think I would say is that besides sort of short versus long term, internal versus external, some of your experience or in talking about experience is going to depend upon your conceptualization of civil society or the voluntary sector. So are we just talking about the response of formal organisations versus, for example, the mutual aid groups? Are we thinking about the role of business and civil society? Because it's very much the case that government would see business as part of civil society in their strategy. And you could argue that actually some of the really important responses during certainly the first part of the crisis actually came from business. And then, of course, issues around individuals and sort of who ordinarily volunteers. So, moving swiftly on. My sense in the short term is that I very much feel like voluntary organisations that I come across every day, that they stepped up and they tried to respond to the massive increase in demand that came with the COVID crisis. And it struck me that there were two types of demand. One was people who needed support because they were isolated or they were shielding or sort of something like that. But I think just as importantly was demand from people who wanted voluntary organisations to help them to help other people. There was a massive upswell in people who wanted to get involved, so much so that it was too much. Secondly, I think there was a big increase in terms of cross-sectoral collaboration and also collaboration within the sector. And I think we saw organisations putting aside historic differences and rivalries, which I think that was a good thing. And I could give you many examples at the national and local level of our sector doing what it does best at a time of crisis in terms of responding to urgent need. And you can look at big organisations like the British Red Cross or St John Ambulance. And then I'm a trustee of a small local infrastructure called Communities First, where we massively increased the number of volunteers that we were processing and then engaging with. It's also worth, I think, noting in terms of delivery that, I mean, our sector is widely perceived as sort of being a bit amateurish and inefficient. And actually big organisations like the Royal Voluntary Service and the NHS Responder Scheme, they mobilised massively at scale very quickly. And I think that's sort of worth noting for the future. Probably also sort of worth saying that as many steps up, some organisations closed down. National Trust would be a good example of that couldn't do sort of what it did. Then a final sort of thing I would say in the short term is that we never ever forget that much as I sort of want to be an advocate for the voluntary sector and civil society, ultimately it was people and communities who were the first responders in the sort of places sort of where they live. My second sort of thing to talk about in terms of experience is probably around the tensions that sort of came. So I think there were tensions between our sector and government. And listening to Chris Dayson yesterday, it was interesting that he framed that as a sort of based on a falling out with government. I think it's possibly worse than that. I think it was a perception in government that basically we were an irrelevance and that we weren't part of the solution when it sort of came to sort of solving society's problems. I think there were tensions between national and local responses and the fact that we couldn't quite get to the sort of the connection between those right, just as there were tensions between the mutual aid groups and what you might call existing civil society sort of infrastructure. A good example of that would be safeguarding, where some of the mutual aid groups were not keen on the approaches to safeguarding that, say, traditional organisations have used. And then there were tensions in our sector around where and who the virus was sort of impacting upon the most. So I think I'm making a reference there specifically to Black and minority ethnic communities and how, although they were at the forefront of impact, was it the case that the short-term response of funders and the funding community in our sector actually responded to where need was greatest? And I mean, there's a longer sort of discussion there. So looking ahead, I'm going to talk first about my worries. I'm worried, first of all, about the messages that people are going to take away from the crisis about volunteering and the role of voluntary action, and the idea that it's always informal and it can just sort of spring out of nothing and it doesn't need any coordination or organisation. And I'm worried that they'll perceive that what works in the short term can also work in the long term. I'm also worried that there's clearly a significant financial challenge for our sector, not just in the autumn and winter of this year, but over the next few years. And actually, the crisis has, you might argue, really challenged some of the orthodoxy around social enterprise and the models that we've got in terms of sustainability. And I'm concerned that COVID strikes almost at the heart of what it is that civil society is about. It's people physically coming together, talking about the good society and sort of doing things together. And there's a real irony that at a time, I'd argue, when we potentially have the most to deliver and we're needed most, it sort of precludes our normal sort of operating sort of system. And it's another conversation, but I am slightly skeptical about sort of digital as some great panacea that's going to emerge from COVID, and how we're all going to sort of work at home. I'm a bit more skeptical about that than I was probably a few years ago. But I'm going to finish on some hopes, on some positives. I wonder if one of the things that comes out of the COVID crisis is that people are more interested and engaged in community, and they're more interested in a sense of the local than maybe they were before. Though I'm conscious that some of this might be just COVID confirmation bias sort of on my part. And one of the great questions that for me no one has answered yet is whether this great upswell in volunteering, and especially informal volunteering, whether that genuinely is new and additional people, or whether it's people that couldn't volunteer in the roles that they were doing before because the crisis stopped them. My second cause of optimism is that I think local government has rediscovered our sector. I think Brian especially will probably talk about that a bit more, but that feels to me something to build upon. And my final sort of hope of optimism is that when I say that sort of people and government have sort of rediscovered the sector, I wonder if there's more interest in sort of volunteering, this idea of social infrastructure. This idea that society is not just about government or business, but actually the things that make life worth living, the glue that sort of makes us stick together as a community, that comes from getting involved. So these sort of sometimes quite binary debates about, is our sector just about delivering public services or campaigning? I wonder if COVID offers us an opportunity to talk about the fact that voluntary action is valuable just in and of itself, because it builds trust and reciprocity, because it's that sort of those shared norms that it sort of helps build. And I guess I feel optimistic that it opens up the space for a conversation that this stuff being a public good just in and of itself is something that's worth not just preserving but building upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. And now we'll switch to Anna, the Chief Executive of SCVO. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you, Karl. Some of what I'm going to say is very similar to what Karl said. I would probably share some of that, but certainly very different experience of government, which is exactly the conversation we have almost every Friday afternoon when we compare such things. So I think, as Karl said, the civil society or the voluntary sector response to the pandemic has been phenomenal. And everyone's saying that, but what does it actually mean? And what about the bits of the sector that just haven't been able to respond to the immediate crisis, but really need to be part of recovery and renewal? And I would agree with Carol, we're not in that phase yet. We're certainly not in renewal, we're at the very foothills of recovery. So from quite early on in lockdown, at SCVO, we started collating information about the impact of the pandemic on the sector and the people that those voluntary organisations work with. We had lots of direct feedback, and we also are continue to collate information from people's newsletters like Citizens Advice Scotland, Children in Scotland, Befrienders Network, and all of that stuff is accessible in the evidence library on our website, and we produce quarterly information sheets about the key points that are emerging. But we also identified that there was a bit of survey fatigue quite early on. I think we had that before COVID, but we've got it even more now, because there's lots of bits of work with different organisations all asking the same questions and all finding the same things. So what we did then, and what we're in the midst of now, is coordinating a group of academics, funders, infrastructure bodies, the charity regulator in Scotland and Scottish Government, to look at how we work collaboratively to identify what the existing research tells us, where the gaps are, and how we might go about filling those gaps. And we're all working together just now to draft that research spec for a longitudinal panel survey for a more robust collective analysis. So in the first few weeks, different issues bubbled up and then kind of simmered down again. Obviously, at the beginning, it was access to food, medicine. It was those real hygiene factors that emerged as issues. And then we had data poverty, so not data in a researchy sense, obviously, but data as in your phone or your device. Data poverty is a new phrase to me, but it's big. Social isolation, and even for a few days, credit unions bubbled up as a really big issue for us. But one of the things I've really noticed is the focus on acute services nationally and locally also had an unintended consequence. So it took resource in terms of time and money away from voluntary organisations and community groups who were playing really important roles for people with long-term health conditions. And we're seeing a wee bit of reset of that just now, but still quite a focus on acute services. And also the impact obviously on fundraising and trading was really dramatic in its speed and its scale. And that's been an issue that's hit all organisations, all shapes and sizes, all over the country. And that's crucial for the sustainability and the independence of the sector to have that ability to generate unrestricted income, even if the methods by which we go about that are different. So, as my contrast to what Carl was saying, the Scottish Government stepped up really quickly with £350 million of crisis funding for the sector within the first couple of weeks. And some of that was specifically targeted. Some of it was routed through local authorities, a lot was routed through local authorities, and some of it was open to open application. So SCVO is still working with a group of independent grant makers who have that expertise to be a single entry point, an assessment point for those funds. And the last phase of that funding is just about to open in the next couple of weeks. We're in that position where the First Minister has to announce something every single day. So civil servants are kind of scurrying about trying to find something. And our recovery fund is one of those things that it'll just pop up one day at First Minister's questions and then we'll suddenly have to launch it. So we had about half an hour's notice the first time round. So that's been a really coordinated new piece of work with us working with independent funders to distribute government money through a single point of entry. We're also working really closely on the back of that, with the government analysts and the grant makers to draw out the learning from it. So about the funding itself, but also about the needs and communities that the applications tell us about. And I think again, reflecting what Karl said, what I've experienced is lots of volunteer organisations who were previously competing or operating on their own specialist areas of interest suddenly found each other and are working together collectively to meet the needs of their communities. And often that was in positive partnership with local authorities, but not always. And it really has brought to life the rhetoric that we've got in Scotland about community empowerment, about focus on outcomes. It actually happened. Not always and not everywhere, but a lot. And we really need to hang on to that. But it also made really visible the places where there were no established relationships or where the relationships were poor. And it was really noticeable to me that areas like Dumfries and Galloway, who'd been at the sharp end of the foot and mouth crisis back in the day, they were really geared up to work collectively on an emergency, but other areas much less so. But the other side of the coin is that whole swathes of the sector had to stop overnight. And some still haven't reopened. So art, sport, heritage, some aspects of youth work, for example, and those are we really need those things to be part of the fabric of our society as we emerge for the future. We need participative, cultural, well-being activity. But it's been really interesting for me to see that some of our ministers have actually realised that tourism in Scotland is dependent on the voluntary sector. It's not all about hotels and transport. So visitor attractions from the Pier Art Gallery in Orkney, which is gorgeous if you've never been there, to wee community cafes, to the National Trust, they all need support to keep going. And that's not just financial support, but it's to be recognised in national and local strategies, to resume their activities while keeping themselves and the people that are their customers or their service users safe. But finally, as Carl said, this has been a really interesting time for volunteering. And despite us warning them not to, Scottish Government, like all the other administrations, did a big call to action. And while it was understandable, and to be honest, but really to be honest, there was not enough for those people to do, and certainly not things for them to do safely. So now we're left with a lot of people who have felt ignored. We've got lots of older people who really enjoyed volunteering, who contributed so much to the sector, and for whom volunteering really brings a sense of identity, are feeling excluded and left behind. There's so many aspects, though, of the impact of the virus that goes beyond the immediate health symptoms, and weighing up all those different risks and implications is a total minefield. I wouldn't want to be that person. But community action has come alive while many of the organisations that support it are under threat, which is really interesting. And that's a conundrum that's been addressed in the Social Renewal Advisory Board that we have. Two of our cabinet secretaries, so equivalent of Secretary of State, have convened, bringing together national voluntary sector organisations and local government to make sure that the recovery isn't that old school GDP focused economic stuff, but it's really about well-being and an inclusive economy, again, trying to bring the rhetoric to life. And that's all, everything that we've talked about, both Carl and I, is captured in the Never More Needed campaign that's going on just now. If you look at hashtag Never More Needed, you'll see the vibrancy and the contribution of the voluntary sector absolutely in all its glory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for that. And just a reminder, John's popped it in the chat as well. If you've got questions for the presenters, please put them in the Q&A so we can use those in the discussion after they've finished speaking. Now I'd like to invite Brian Carr. He's been the Chief Executive of Birmingham Voluntary Service Council since 2005. It focuses on providing advocacy and business development support to Birmingham civil society, promoting volunteering and advising others on how to engage with civil society. Now, Brian's going to use some slides, which I have. So let me just share my screen while Brian starts to speak, and hopefully we can do this.
Great. Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I spent some time in yesterday's sessions and had a really great day, and I hope everyone enjoys today as much as I enjoyed yesterday. So thank you, Carolyn, for handling my slides, thanks to the technical limitations at my end. If we move to the next slide, you'll see the outline of what I'm going to talk about. So this isn't a linear structure. I'm going to meander fairly swiftly between the areas of what we did in Birmingham, or what happened in Birmingham, what we learned from that, and what we need to take into consideration for the future. And it is important to say here that the learning I'm talking about at this stage is pretty observational on my part. It's based on my own assessment of things. However, BVSC, as we speak, is in the final week of data gathering for what we hope will be a fairly comprehensive state of the sector report, which is looking at the impact of COVID on civil society and the voluntary sector in Birmingham. So that's shortly going to be analysed and written up. So I suspect I'm very soon going to learn whether my observational reflections here are accurate or if I'm just flapping my gums. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. So I'd like to begin by highlighting a couple of foundational factors, things that I think really set the tone for Birmingham's civil society COVID-19 response. And I'm going to come right out here and say that all told, that response was a highly successful one. But without these foundations, I don't think it would have necessarily been as successful or smooth running as it was. And the first thing is something that Karl alluded to, and that is that the tone in terms of the voluntary sector's engagement was very much set at an early stage by the way that the City Council reached out to us. It did that by bringing various CSOs together in its Homelessness Partnership Board. That's a cross-sector group that includes the local arms of very large organisations like Shelter, Women's Aid, MenCap, Mind, as well as various local organisations that have a citywide focus on tackling complex needs and homelessness. And they called an emergency meeting of that board right at the beginning of the pandemic, and the group was given some pretty early doors information about what was about to land at the city's doorstep. That spoke, I think, to the city's preparedness, but it also spoke to their trust in the voluntary sector as partners. And we've spent quite a lot of time at BVSC for the past couple of years working on building up that relationship after several years of there being no investment in voluntary sector infrastructure support. The second thing that's worth highlighting, I think, is that the citizen and community level response was, of course, immediate. It didn't need stimulation or invitation. And BVSC recognised that it was nobody's role to manage that. That was the territory of community groups and neighbours and volunteers that just swung into action and that work best when it's left to be spontaneous and effective. Although, as Karl pointed out, sometimes they needed support in terms of things like safeguarding, volunteer safety, health, and so on. So our role there was to nurture that and support it and to sometimes nudge it in the right direction. Okay, next slide, Carolyn. So on a practical level, what we did was we convened something that we call the C19 Support Brum Partnership, and that pulled together about 35 voluntary sector leaders whose organisations covered every ward or every district in the city, 10 districts, and just about every specialist service that was needed by those most at risk. And the thematic leads, of course, focused on that specialised support, that expert support, and the local leads, who were community anchor organisations in districts, focused particularly on supporting the elderly and the vulnerable and engaging with mutual aid groups and others. So we were able to join up a pretty responsive web of support and communication right across the city. Now, like any web, of course, that had its gaps, but the important thing is that because of the multifaceted connections that were in place, it also had an integrity that was able to respond really quickly to need as soon as gaps became apparent. And that speaks, I think, to one of the key characteristics of Birmingham's response, and that is that we deliberately worked on it being partnership-based and distributed leadership. So we let leaders lead, and that in turn led to some real successes that were driven by CSOs. So our food lead, the Active Wellbeing Society, helped to secure food deliveries into the city when the supermarkets were struggling to get that happening. And they worked with the food banks and mutual aid groups to get supplies to vulnerable people in the city in every locality. And that was quite a long time before the government shielding scheme kicked in. Our disability lead, Midland MenCap, advocated tirelessly for access to PPE supplies, and they helped agencies source equipment as soon as it became available, sometimes from quite unlikely places, you know, business people calling up and saying, I found a cupboard of PPE, do you want it? And our homelessness and housing leads collaborated and worked together with the council to get rough sleepers off the streets and into safe accommodation impressively quickly and very smoothly. Okay, next slide. I won't say too much about this, but just to also mention that we were able to work with the Children's Directorate at the City Council and the Children's Trust to establish a range of emergency interventions and crisis funding pots, both for local groups and vulnerable families. And in fact, that early help work is carrying on and will be developed a bit further. Okay. So just to reflect on what I think have been the key strengths of what happened in Birmingham, I think the first thing to say is that there was a full spectrum, what I would call a full spectrum civil society approach. It involved and didn't stifle the input of citizens, community groups, charities, and various cross-sector partnerships. And that network was able to pay real-time attention to community needs. And at quite an early stage in the pandemic, we set up a telephone helpline. And that enabled us, through our sector partners, to get emergency food and medical supplies to people, usually on the same day, sometimes within the same hour, and that was including at weekends and evenings. But that could only happen because different parts of the sector work together. So what we heard earlier about groups that hadn't previously worked together, suddenly finding themselves and working together in new ways. And organizational egos were left at the door. Everything was moving so fast that people didn't have time to cleave to their old, kind of tried and trusted territorialism, shall we say. And And all of that, I think, raises a really important point for Birmingham. I've worked in the city for about 20 years, and if you've been in this part of the sector for any amount of time, you know that views of the sector and of civil society tend to shift. And they tend to shift depending on things like the way that the political wind is blowing, which public sector organisation or department you're dealing with, and of course, depending on the individuals you're dealing with, often in a commissioning context. And the shift can often be between the view that either the large provider-led end of the sector is in favour, or that the smaller grassroots community groups part of the sector is in favour. And I find that endlessly irritating and really completely bogus. We should know this, but I think what this recent experience has indicated is that both ends of the spectrum and everything in between is important. And of course, civil society is not a linear spectrum anyway. So I'm passionate about reminding anyone who will listen that when it comes to civil society, it's either or, it's not both and. So moving on to our challenges, or the challenges that we picked up, and some of these, obviously, Karl and Karl mentioned in terms of the national picture that NCVO's seen. But I think it's also worth highlighting we need to acknowledge the disproportionate impact on BAME communities and recognise our collective responsibility in both creating and remedying that situation. And BVSC is about to do some work with the sector. Yep. Okay. It's about to do some work with the sector in Birmingham to develop an anti-racist approach and share that with our partners. And we also need to think about how we keep the level of connectivity post-pandemic. How do we stay so engaged when there is not a visible crisis when we move out of it? And part of that is about avoiding the bureaucracy and being sucked into the way we did things before. We've seen that the system can move really fast when it needs to. So how do we keep that happening? And then finally, I've been asked to say a little bit about what I think the role of research is in all of this, because obviously this is a research conference. So unsurprisingly, I think it's vitally important, not least because I think it can help us address some of the challenges that we've talked about, which often take the form of questions we need to ask ourselves. And in fact, we've set up BVSC research partly to do that in Birmingham. But I think the key thing to say is it's important that we focus on researching what genuinely works and moving beyond our preferences and expectations. And I have seen a couple of recent reports, research reports locally that have tended to come up with results that I suspect the commissioners of the research wanted to hear. So we've got to guard against that. And my final plea would be that, you know, going back to this issue of the full spectrum of civil society, or the ecology of civil society, many different elements of that ecology played their parts. So let's give them their due by examining them and considering what that means for the shape of civil society in the future. Okay. Oh, you're muted, I think, Carolyn.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Brian. That's fantastic. And our fourth speaker is Affan Cheema. He's the head of program quality at Islamic Relief Worldwide, which works actively in over 40 countries globally, especially with communities to mitigate the effect of disasters, to promote development and address the root causes of poverty. Affan's going to give us an international viewpoint, which takes us outside of the UK, perhaps. I'm not sure what he's going to say. Experiencing COVID, Affan.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and thank you to all the speakers. As Carolyn indicated, I am going to give you a bit more of an international feel, although I will be looking at a few aspects domestically. As with all global organisations, Islamic Relief has been forced to change the way we work, fundraise and support communities in the 40 countries we operate in. The process has been challenging. We've had to adapt. We've had to follow the guidelines, whether they were in the UK, whether they were in Pakistan, whether they're in Kenya, whether they're in Niger, Mali, etc. And believe you me, they were different in every single country. But the adaptation process has meant we've discovered new ways of working. And in some ways, it represented a period of reflection. It's very easy to also be business as usual all the time. So we've explored new ways of operating, new ways of delivering. Now, what we initially did was all the programming work that we had in different countries, we had to do what we call pivot it. pivot it towards COVID work. And in that context, you know, the donors that were funding us were very good, meaning UK government at that time, DFID was DFID. So we actually had some very good internal meetings with them. At national level, a lot of the initial response was a health response in effect. It was PPE, it was working with hospitals, working with your own health programs, but very much doing it with local civil society, doing it with local national government, so you were feeding into that. And in terms of coordination, you had the World Health Organization represented along with the UN coordinating body, which is in essence OCHA. So to give you an example, Yemen, you know, we'll, if we can, and it's difficult to put the conflict to the side for 1 second, what you've got is you're distributing food. Now, normally these are, you know, standard processes that we use. However, we had to radically change that. The planning was very different. The number of distributions we were doing were a lot more because a lot less people were allowed to come to your site. It was socially distanced when we were doing a distribution. So a normal process is a case of people come to a point. We were basically going out and putting things out and then moving away. Now that puts strain. That puts strain on an organization and its resource. Operationally, 3 big areas. One was community engagement. How do we get the message out to people about COVID? In many countries, there was still the element, no, this isn't real. This isn't really happening, you know, and many countries said, we can't afford lockdown. We don't have social protection mechanisms. We've got to keep on working. So we were putting out health news about promoting good health, hygiene practices, how you can keep operating by while still social distancing. But how's that being done? Radio, TV adverts, phone, WhatsApp, and getting hold of community leaders that we had. Second was, as I mentioned, health centres and PPE, medical supplies, screening. The last thing, which is more the long-term bit, is those living around the poverty line. And many of them have fallen below that poverty line because of COVID. Their sources of income, labour, small business activities, small-scale farming, it's all been affected by elements of lockdown, whether that's them not being able to do it or the supply chains. So we're really looking at this element of micro business. Right, let me switch over a little here from overseas to national. Fundraising. COVID came at a very interesting time for an organization like Islamic Relief, a Muslim faith-based agency, because it came in the middle of Ramadan. And for us, that's 40% of our income. That's where it comes. So we did not have the mosque structures, so you weren't going into mosques. We did not have the aspects of community group meetings or large fundraising events. And we needed some real innovation there. And that innovation represented itself in more investment in direct marketing efforts. So online stuff, virtual mosques, element of using Zoom to do fundraising. We also, because of that, the aspect of Ramadan, we put our own financial resilience plan together, which meant no more travel abroad. It meant even within country, limited travel for staff, reducing our consultancy overhead, etc. Now, what actually, from the fundraising perspective, what actually happened to us? Believe it or not, we actually had an increase in income during Ramadan. And that's something we are right now doing some studies to understand why did that occur? You know, was it because the mosques were closed that the communities went towards the charities? Was it because the economic impact of COVID has not hit yet? So the empathy element still meant a vast amount of outgiving. And we're very clear that once the economic impact does hit, we may be hit further on down the line in terms of our income and next Ramadan in effect. Although that's kind of a positive story on the income side, being somebody who sits in the sector with other stakeholders, I am going to say that is a bit of an exception. The reality is most have been hit quite hard. Many in the sector are drawing up plans which mean either scale down or it means redundancies. Now, ultimately, what does that hit? That hits the people on the ground. So, although with that cautious optimism, there's also the opportunities that come. Now, I've talked a little bit about the fundraising opportunities, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the international opportunities that presented. It taught us new ways to work. So I'll give you an example: community complaints mechanisms. A traditional approach is you've got people in the community, whether they're national organizations, civil society, you've got staff in communities, you've got officers in the communities, you have boxes. So communities tend to use those. Communities in many of the places we work do not tend to go for mobile technology or an email complaint box. It's more they like the face-to-face aspect. We had to shift that, and we had to be a bit more proactive on making phone calls to community members to get feedback and really pulling that data together. Another one was Ramadan, where we do physical distributions on the ground. We went for cash programming because we felt that would have more of an impact with the communities rather than giving physical items out, so that they could at least utilize that where they felt that they best needed it. So it acted as a bit of a social protection mechanism.
Affan, 2 minutes.
No problem. Closer to home, international meetings. For us, when you were in Birmingham and you had somebody, you were in a group meeting, somebody in Niger, Mali, Pakistan, and you're in an office, sometimes the person on the other side can feel a bit like a second-class citizen. This was a massive equalizer, because you are all, from a power perspective, you are all in the same space. Ultimately, when it comes to research, and I'm just going to wrap up here, we are looking at a socioeconomic recovery framework, which is about resilience. We think the economic crisis is to hit, and it's to hit bad. And from our data, what we are looking at, we're looking to protect livelihoods, rebuild them, enhance them, and create resilient communities. Because our research is showing the people that have been hit worst were the marginalized, people, day laborers, and don't forget the aspects of behind the walls of a household. Women and girls and GBV is going up, and we have that data from certain countries. Within that, another piece of data that we're starting to discover is around the role of people with disabilities and how they are completely marginalized and often not thought about within the whole COVID-19 impact within many of these countries. Now, I'm going to stop there, Carolyn, but I'm just going to end it with the challenge we have is, yes, we're trying to deal with COVID, but at the same time, in many of these countries we're operating in, it's exacerbated by conflict, drought, all types of fragility. And I could give you a list across East Africa and Asia right now. COVID is an issue, yes, but they're just suffering from immense floods right now. So I'll stop there, Carolyn, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Affan. And I'm going to hand over to John, who's been keeping an eye on the Q&A, which looks very busy, to draw on some of those to place to the speakers. Thank you.
Yes, so lots of conversation going on in the chat box, and nearly a dozen questions coming in through the Q&A. What I'm going to do is try and group some of them together and ask them to ask three at once and ask them to the entire panel, and panel, you can answer whichever question you wish, or give quick answers to two or three. So a question from Rachel, who's interested in, have you seen over the past several months good examples of the voluntary sector, government and business working together in ways that help communities through the crisis. I think business probably gets forgotten about in our discussions, but obviously it's a key part of things. Secondary, around mutual aid groups, Carl in the chat used the word that maybe we're fetishizing mutual aid groups a little bit, and Chris asks, is this just a name that we've given to things that are currently happening or been happening for a long time? So some reflections on that. And Gethin and Harriet have asked questions about bureaucracy in relation to something Brian mentioned about trying to get out the way and not impose top-down structures. How do we stop bureaucratic approaches creeping back in? What actual things should we be putting in place? What changes should we be making to try and, if we have seen an attempt to do everything a bit more bottom up recently, how do we stop bureaucracy creeping back in? Brian, you've got your mic unmuted, so why don't you go first?
I should have known that was unwise. So, well, if I just touch quickly on the issue of business to start with, we know that business in Birmingham, certainly mediated through the auspices of the Birmingham Chamber, were very involved in the kind of strategic level activity. And there were pockets of examples of businesses trying to provide support through financial input. And as I mentioned, you know, some businesses that had equipment they were able to share. But I don't think that really found its way into the mainstream in the way that we perhaps would have liked. And that was partly to do with the fact, maybe to do with the speed that everything else was moving at. I think to some extent, business in a strange way found it quite difficult to keep up with the pace of what was happening at a very local level, certainly in Birmingham. Picking up on the issue of mutual aid groups, you know, yeah, I completely agree. There is a tendency, I think, to just use that badge for everything that happened at a local level. But there were mutual aid groups that were specifically part of the mutual aid group network, and that were registering themselves online, not formally, but online as mutual aid groups, and that would have called themselves mutual aid groups. And then there were other local activities that were happening that wouldn't have badged themselves as mutual aid groups. So we've got to be careful we don't kind of conflate the two. And Carl's quite right to say we shouldn't, you know, fetishize that. It wasn't all perfect. You know, we had some examples locally of mutual aid groups butting heads with other organisations and so on. But I have to say, in Birmingham, that was really quite rare. On the whole, the connection between the more organised side of things and that local response was pretty good.
Thank you.
Do you want me to say anything about the what we're doing in terms of the?
We'll move on to another speaker and try and come back to you. Karl, do you have any views maybe about mutual aid?
Yeah, I guess what I was sort of trying to say there is that you know, we came across some examples where let's say approaches to safeguarding were not as strong enough as you would expect them to be, and it strikes me that one of the key challenges that we've got around volunteering in this country and sort of the future is that you've got a society that wants to like eradicate risk from all our activities and expects us to sort of have everything safeguarded to the nth degree. And then you've got a sort of a population of potential volunteers that want informality and flexibility and don't like anything to do with that. And I'm not sure that we've always got that right in sort of different situations. And sometimes what seems to me sometimes like the media and some people in government, their sort of belief that mutual aid groups are the answer to everything. I'm not sure it's a recognition that they work in sort of different places. Just very quickly on the voluntary sector government business sort of working together. I thought Brian made a really important point. I found myself being a bit embarrassed at times that you had business organisations who were saying, "Hey, like if you've got to do food deliveries, we've got a fleet of vans and we can sort of offer these to you," and we couldn't mobilise quickly enough to take advantage of those things. So I guess if there's a lesson there, and I think this came out in the plenary yesterday, is that it's not enough just to be able to sort of be agile and efficient and to be able to mobilize sort of services very quickly. We've got to have more of a conversation about structure and specifically infrastructure and resilience. And there's got to be a conversation in our sector, as there has to be in society more broadly, that if you want resilience, it rather implies that you have capacity that is latent. And we've been so obsessed with efficiency, we've squeezed all the latent capacity out, so that when the second crisis comes, you know, we might not be ready.
Okay, thank you. I think that goes some way to answering a question Chris Dayson asked in the comments as well about what we have to do to build a COVID resilient society, and government has to actually allow a bit of flexibility perhaps. Anna, do you have any reflections on the 3 questions?
Yeah, so on the first one, Rachel's one about private sector working in partnership. I was speaking at an event yesterday, well, virtually, of course, in a local authority area in Scotland where there's a really great example called the Larder in West Lothian. And there's a wee film about it, but because I've turned off my emails so that I didn't get distracted during this, I can't put it into the chat, but I will send it on after. But basically that was about private businesses, as in supermarkets, convenience stores and food retailers working together with the voluntary sector and the council to get food to people, and to reroute things that would have been used for hot meals or cafes or things like that, but reroute them into meals and the ingredients of meals being delivered to people, to the right people that needed them. And it is a great example. It works really well, and I will show you the wee film virtually another time, but it's actually, it just sums it up totally perfectly. On the mutual aid thing, that's a term that I only hear when I talk to colleagues from the rest of the UK. Maybe people in Scotland do use it, but I don't know. I just think it is what somebody in the chat said. It's people doing stuff and people helping each other out. It might just be community. We do talk about social action or community action, so it may well be that. I think there is a danger, and it's the lessons from Grenfell, it's the lessons from bad weather events, terrorist attacks, that well-meaning people doing well-meaning things can actually be a bit of a problem. It can be really good, but it can also butt up against each other, like Brian said, or it can be duplicating, or actually it can get in the way. So there's something about not dampening the enthusiasm and that passion of people, because it's fantastic, but making sure that it actually achieves what everybody wants it to achieve, without the bureaucracy. I think there's a question on bureaucracy that none of us are answering. So, but we don't know the answer to that. What we want is to keep the best bits. But remember that actually some bureaucracy is there for a reason, and then you do need a bit of governance and a bit of robustness. Because of a recovering regulator, it's not all bad, but there's definitely been too much of it. I think I would describe it as we've put systems in for weeding out the one bad apple rather than empowering the 99 good apples.
Okay. Thank you very much. On that issue, Affan, on that issue of bureaucracy, some people are asking whether your organisation has sort of taken a bit more risk in how it's given out its money, cash payments during COVID, and do you think that'll carry on? Whether actually there's been a bit more flexibility and a bit more quick pace and taking a bit more of a risk?
Yeah, I mean, in cash programming in the overseas sector is something which is, it's not something unknown, and there are certain standards behind it. Is it a slightly bigger risk? Yes, you need stronger monitoring and evaluation mechanisms behind it. You need better data behind it. But as a actual mechanism, there are some really well-written guidelines and approaches to that. If for 2 seconds, John, if I could just reflect on something in terms of some of my observations as somebody who obviously lived here in Birmingham and through the COVID crisis, and what I saw compared to how the international sector at times works. And I saw a lot of energy from volunteers and different people, and I saw community groups pop up, etc., and do lots of things. And I thought that was brilliant, but at the same time, with my, the few decades of experience in the international sector, I sat back and I did think about, hang on, how's this being coordinated? Or, you've got a certain amount of resources and you've got to do the best you can. And I'm by no means saying the international sector does it in a perfect manner, meaning there are areas in that as well. But one of the first things we do, and in all these countries, is there is a cluster system. You go into what they call a cluster system, which the UN usually holds and the national governments hold. And as national NGOs or international NGOs, you move into that to collect data, get it from other people, to get kind of national plans.
Okay.
And that's quite smooth right now. And that might be something that the national setups here might want to get the best of it and throw out the worst of that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes remaining. I'm going to ask 2 questions and give everybody maybe 90 seconds each to think about which of these questions they want to look at. So one is from Paul, and it's the big question I think we're probably all asking. The positive question is, how do we make sure we don't lose the momentum and utilize this moment to build stronger and more active citizenship? So maybe what's the one thing that you would either recommend organizations do or people do or government do to keep that momentum going? And a related maybe question from Beth Breeze at the Centre for Philanthropy: what can and should be done to ensure charities continue to invest in fundraising throughout the crisis, particularly the role of both paid and volunteer fundraisers and the ways in which they've had to work throughout the crisis? So if anyone would like to go first, 90 seconds each. I'm sorry to have to push you for time. Who's going to turn their mic on first? This is the challenge. Karl? Yeah.
I'll have a crack at Beth's question first. On fundraising, I mean, to me, the big barrier is, it comes back to so much in terms of sort of community fundraising and so on that is dependent on us literally physically coming together, is still not possible because of COVID and social distancing rules. So in as much as we invest in fundraising, we've got to try and find a way to enable what you might call COVID resilient fundraising, to replace that sort of or to sort of find a new way of doing that sort of face-to-face stuff. And as much as anything, that's going to be about trying to get government to take fundraising seriously. And this is what the point I was trying to make earlier, is that we're not big or important enough as a sector to be at the top of civil servants' minds when it comes to designing new rules around what organisations do. On the momentum issue, I think the really critical point here is that we have to make sure that people getting involved and giving their time have had a good quality experience. I really think it's that simple. And unfortunately, one of the things that I think has come out of the call today is that some people have not had a good experience because the safeguarding has been poor. They've been asked to get involved and then no one has rung them for 6 months. We've got to get better at the basics. It's nothing new about COVID.
Thank you, Karl. Brian?
Well, just to echo what Karl said, I think the other thing in terms of keeping momentum going is we've got to win the argument that civil society has to be at the heart of recovery and what comes next. And I saw a question in the chat asking what we're doing in Birmingham. So we're part of the group that is actually writing the city's recovery plan. So we're going to try and weave the civil society aspect into that. And in terms of fundraising, I don't think there's a very easy answer to that. One of the opportunities I guess many organizations have now is we're going to have to restructure ourselves quite significantly in the light of what's happened. And so now is the chance to bite the bullet and invest in fundraising as part of our future planning and budgets and business plans. That won't be easy, but it's vital.
Thank you very much, Brian. Anna?
Yeah, I agree with Carol on the momentum. I think it is about that sort of valuing social action. I mean, we have legislation in Scotland about community empowerment, but it's been a bit of a slippery thing to get hold of until COVID, and we've seen it absolutely in action. But I think we do benefit from our government, and actually it's a cross-party thing in Scotland. It's not just our government. The current administration really get it. They get the importance of the voluntary sector. They might not get the full diversity of what it is, but they know that there is a need to engage, and actually it brings something to Scotland. In terms of fundraising, I have to say, maybe naively, I was a bit astonished that fundraisers were the first people to get furloughed at this time, because I kind of thought they're never more needed, to coin a phrase. They're absolutely essential. But I can understand it when you're in a rock and a hard place situation. But I think it's really important to stop talking about funding and to start talking about income generation, because funding feels like a really passive concept, and that you're the recipient and you're receiving, and you should be grateful for that. But it's about that ability to generate income from whatever source that it is that we really need to nurture.
Thank you. There was a great paper yesterday from Leslie Alborough about fundraisers on furlough, so I encourage people to look at that. Affan, a final word?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting question here, and I'm going to talk about kind of the volunteers. Where do you invest? And I'm going to go back to a point I think Carl made on digital. do you shift because of this experience to a more digital approach, or do you go with some of the traditional face-to-face? And I think it's important that we don't lose that social action spirit of engaging with communities, because that's what we're there to do. And I think sometimes in a business environment, some of the learning might be, right, let's all go digital. And I think we will lose the spirit of civil society if we shift too much in that direction.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Carolyn, do you have some final words to wrap up? Sorry we didn't get through every question.
I do. First, thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you to the participants for their questions. And of course, we must finish with a Māori proverb, having started with one. So, e hari takutoa, e te toa takatahi, engari he toa takatini. And that means success is not the work of one, but the work of all together. And I feel that we've talked a lot about collaboration, a lot about moving forward. And so I wish you success as we work together towards a better society. Thank you for joining us today, and look forward to you in some other sessions. Thank you.